Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It is January 16th, high noon. And there we have Ryan joining us. That's awesome. My name is John Dehlin. I'm super excited today for our discussion. Basically, we're going to be analyzing 2016 LDS Church membership statistics with sociologists Ryan Cragun and Rick Phillips. We're streaming this. We're streaming this discussion live. I have Rick on, and Ryan, you're there, but you're muted. I don't know if you're able to unmute. Ryan's having some technical difficulties. So what we'll do is we'll give Ryan a chance to get this set up, and we'll go ahead and start with Rick. But before we do, I just want to make a few announcements. First of all, I just showered, so my hair is a little bit messed up. But
you smell nice.
Thanks, Rick. I appreciate that vote of confidence. Before we begin, I guess there's a few announcements that I'd like to make. The two announcements I think maybe most important are around a couple events that we have coming up. So if you go to MormonTransitions.org, which is where we post our events, January 26th and 27th in Anaheim, California, we'll be having a workshop, Mormon Transitions Workshop, which is people's chance to meet and discuss and receive support and community around any difficulties they're having navigating faith transition within Mormonism or leaving Mormonism. These workshops touch on healthy relationships, healthy marriage, raising healthy kids, secular spirituality, positive mental health, and they're really healing and useful for people. Normally, these events they're rated 4.9 out of 5, very high customer satisfaction. So if any of you are interested in joining us in Anaheim, California, January 26th or 27th, go to mormontransitions.org/events and you can check those out. And then we also have our next Mormon Transitions Retreat, which is a 3-day weekend scheduled for March 10th through 12th in Salt Lake City. Those retreats are even more in-depth. You can make some of the best friends you'll ever make in your life. You'll learn about healthy marriages, healthy relationships, raising healthy kids, secular spirituality. They're just incredibly fun events. We do karaoke, and they're outstanding. So if you're interested in either the workshop or the retreat on March 10th through 12th in Salt Lake City, please go to mormontransitions.events, and you can register there. Those are the main announcements. Other than that, it is 2017. This is the first Mormon Stories interview of 2017. It's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It would have been awesome if we had something to discuss around race in the Mormon Church. I don't know that there's anything new or interesting that we could tackle that we haven't already tackled. So if listeners have any suggestions or ideas on what we could do, I'm all ears, but I don't just want to shoot fish in a barrel, so to speak. And I just don't know what good news or developments we have on that front. So I'm open to your feedback. We will be taking your questions live during this discussion. I'm monitoring chats on the group, and I'm just inviting people as they're listening to provide feedback during this live broadcast. So that's enough with the announcements. Ryan, can you hear me? Ryan can't hear me. Okay. Rick, you can hear me. So I'm going to go ahead and invite Rick to introduce himself, and we can hopefully get Ryan on board soon. Ryan is a Linux user, and so we didn't test this stuff out with Linux. But Rick, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
My name is Rick Phillips, and my official title is Associate Professor of Sociology and Religious Studies at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, Florida. And Jacksonville's where you want to be in the middle of January.
I bet.
75 degrees here today. I have studied Mormonism for most of my academic career. I grew up in Ogden, went to Weber State and Utah State before going to Rutgers to get my PhD. And I teach classes in the sociology of religion, sociological theory, and research methods in the social sciences. And that's what I do. I'm married, a couple little kids.
And you analyze sort of these types of statistics for a living, is that right?
I did. I have in the earlier part of the decade, I wrote some articles on church growth, and was one of the people who worked on the studies that looked at the disparity between official church statistics and self-identified Latter-day Saints in the General Social Survey and in the American Religious Identification Survey. So I have analyzed these things in the past. These days I study Mormon culture more generally, and I'm writing a sociology of religion textbook, so I don't get to think about Mormonism full-time these days.
All right. Well, and Rick, this isn't the first time we've had you on Mormon Stories, is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It is. Oh, I'm so surprised. We've talked about it so many times that I would have just assumed you'd been on. But welcome. I'm so happy that you're here for
my debut.
Your inaugural Mormon Stories.
Do I get some sort of a wreath or a funny hat for my first time? Or
you should. You should. I'm glad you're on, and I hope you'll join us more often. Okay, Ryan Cragun, I think we have you now. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you great. So beautiful. I'm so glad you're able to connect. I assume it was Linux, right?
Of course. Of course it's Linux.
I see you're dressed for the occasion.
Well, can you see my shirt?
Yeah, I love it.
Wait, what does the shirt say? For those who are just listening, what does your shirt say, Ryan?
Picard for president.
Jean-Luc Picard. You're a nerd. Are you outing yourself as a complete nerd?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, there's no question. Like, I am absolutely the biggest nerd you know.
All right. Well, Ryan, why don't you, this is not your first appearance on Mormon Stories podcast, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience anyway?
Well, you heard Rick's introduction, right? Mine's basically the same thing. Like, we grew up 10 miles from each other. He's a few years older than I am, but otherwise it's like the exact same story, except I think my family's bigger than his. Devout LDS family, live in Morgan, Utah. Almost all of them still live up there. Let's see. I was born in 76, grew up LDS, did everything, seminary, graduated from seminary, served a mission to Costa Rica. Came back convinced that I had to figure out this whole Mormonism thing, so I went to graduate school to study it, and lasted about a year thanks to people like Rick. I'm kidding. It wasn't Rick. But no, it didn't work for me, and I ended up leaving. But now this is what I do, right? So I'm a college professor and a research scientist, and I study Mormonism and the non-religious. Those are my two areas of expertise.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we're really thrilled to have you back on. We're also thrilled that so many people are joining us live right now. We have 71 viewers live, and we want to invite our listeners to please ask questions and make comments, and we will incorporate your questions and comments into the episode. I'm really excited about that. We've got people joining from all the way as far as Spain.
Cool.
So,
Hola.
Yeah, hola, absolutely. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in to today's discussion. One of the best sites in Mormonism, I think, is Cumorah.com, Cumorah.com. And it's a site that's run by a guy named Matt Martinich, and I don't exactly know how to spell that name. And I think Matt's got a partner that works with him. But Matt is just this dogged tracker of Mormon statistics over the years. Rick and Ryan, do either of you have sort of your own take on what Matt does? Just to give it sort of your best description.
I have never met Matt, but I have met his colleague, David Stewart. David is a physician who is sort of an amateur demographer, Mormon studies, Mormon statistics watcher. These guys are devout members of the church, and they are interested in seeing the church grow, but they are pretty clear-eyed about how evidence works and about what good proselytizing methods are, and they're interested in actual converts instead of paper converts. And I think a lot of the stuff that David Stewart started doing that Matt sort of picked up on is this idea of how to grow the church strong rather than just grow it big and fast. And so a lot of the early stuff that David Stewart was doing was literally critiquing Mormon missionary efforts. He wrote a book that was, I think, quite critical of the rapid baptism methods that the church had been employing. And I think he's had a pretty big influence. He's an extremely smart guy.
Beautiful. Ryan, anything to add?
No, basically I would echo what Rick said. I think they're both close watchers of the statistics, probably closer than Rick and I are these days. They don't, I mean, other than some book chapters and a book that David has published, I don't recall seeing them publishing in the same journals that Rick and I publish in. Rick, have you seen them publish anything in?
Dave published, we published an article in the Handbook of Mormonism for Oxford University Press, and Dave contributed to that. And he has given some presentations at the meetings for the Scientific Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and that's where I met him.
Right.
So he's a good guy.
Yeah, good guy.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I was really intrigued, and I agree. I think they do great work. Very credible. I was very intrigued with this article that Matt put out on December 31st, 2016, that basically was entitled Top 10 Encouraging and Discouraging LDS Growth and Missionary Developments in 2016. And I think we put a link up for those who want to check that out live. Anyone can Google it as well. But what I want to do for this discussion, we're not here to be apologists for the church, and we're not here to bash the church. We're not here to make the church look like it's declining or look like it's growing. We want to give credit where credit is due. But as far as I'm concerned, one of the biggest questions that I get is, number one, is the church growing, or is it shrinking, or is it staying the same? How do we make sense of the statistics? Even more importantly, I think it's important to understand, is the church healthy? Is it not healthy? And it's probably not it's certainly not a monolithic question, because I imagine that we're going to find out that the church is growing in some areas, declining in some areas, flat in some areas, healthy in some areas, less healthy in some areas. And so there's just, it's going to be a multifaceted discussion. But I know that people are constantly interested in it. So I imagine this is something that we have done and will continue to do on a regular basis. Now, Matt and Ryan, is there anything else you guys want to add in terms of what we are or aren't trying to accomplish in today's episode, or what you would like to accomplish?
Rick, I think he just called you Matt.
Oh, sorry, Matt. Sorry, Rick.
That's all right. Okay, James.
No, that sounds good to me. That sounds good to me.
Is that all right?
Yeah. Let's do that.
All right. Rick, anything to add?
Let's do it.
All right. So overall LDS growth trend case studies, top 10 encouraging and discouraging LDS growth and missionary developments in 2016. We're not going to go into these in depth, but I'll just read a little bit of sort of each of these points, and then we'll just have Rick and Ryan take turns responding, if that's okay. So number one, for encouraging growth and missionary developments, largest number of new stakes created in a single year since 1997. So Matt reports that the church organized 100 new stakes, a nice, clean, round number, 100 new stakes. And I guess they closed 8 stakes. So that gives us sort of a net increase of 92 stakes during 2016, a 2.9% annual increase. All right, Rick, let's have you respond first.
Well, the first thing that I want to say is that these LDS church statistics are incredibly noisy. They bounce around a lot, particularly growth statistics bounce around a lot. And so whenever I analyze these things or look at these things, I don't put too much stock into any 1 year, and I tend to look at the 5-year rolling average or apply smoothing algorithms because they bounce around a lot. So a lot of stakes were created. That's interesting. But it was a year where there were very few congregations created. So, and there was a year where there were very few convert baptisms. So what to make of that? There are probably some possibilities. It could be that convert retention is better now than it has been, and that converts in the past are progressing to the point where they're being ordained to the Melchizedek priesthood, and this supports stake growth. But if it supports stake growth, why doesn't it support congregation growth? I don't know. Another would be a policy where we now have fewer wards per stake, or we're experimenting with the idea of fewer wards in a stake. This would cause the organization of more stakes, even without more membership growth or more congregations. One of the interesting things that you see is very rapid stake growth, large stake growth in the United States in 2016, even though there hasn't been a lot of membership growth in the United States. And this would lead me to believe that there might be some initiative or policy where they're thinking about stakes now with fewer wards in them. But again, I mean, it's all, initial bumps in statistics or little changes in these trend lines usually don't mean that much because the data are pretty noisy. So I wouldn't know, what to make of it. It could be a combination of those things.
Okay. Ryan, what do you have to add?
Well, I think Rick's definitely headed down the right track. This looks to me, especially as we read further into this, like an organizational change that the LDS Church is instituting, where they're saying, we like the idea of having stakes, even if we've got fewer wards, because there's not a concomitant increase in wards, right? And that's a little bit strange, because if this was just genuine growth, then you would get growth at multiple levels, and you're really not seeing that. You're seeing organization of new stakes. So something and again, I'm kind of focusing on just the primary point. Rick is absolutely right about there's a lot of noise in the data. You never know what's going on. They're not all that clear with their numbers, but this sounds to me like some sort of policy change or organizational bureaucratic change where they're just adding.
Unless it could be the case. I haven't looked at the numbers on this to see if there's any evidence for this, but it could be that the stake organization is a lagging indicator. I think it's too early to say what it means.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's too early to sort of celebrate if the church were to come out and say the church is growing as fast as it's ever been. Look, we had a banner year. We're organizing a stake every 3 or 4 days. What would your response be if that was sort of the claim the church?
Well, that would be a dangerous road to go down, because if it's an organizational change and you're deciding that you're going to have fewer wards in stakes, and growth in congregations and growth in membership isn't keeping pace with the growth in stakes, then you're gonna hit the wall. You're gonna collapse. The problem with organizing a stake is that, to me, the growth in stakes is one of the best indicators of church growth, because you can have a branch or a ward with a few members. You can baptize all kinds of people, but a stake has to have a requisite number of Melchizedek priesthood holders in order to sustain itself. So it's a good, I think, indicator of growth, and it's probably not one that you could finesse or fake. I don't think that the church is engaged in any sort of political machination to make it look like they're growing faster in an age of slowing growth. I think what Ryan is saying. I think it is. Somebody in the church office building is saying what might be good for retention, or what might be good to relieve the pressures on local leaders, or what might be good for organizational strength is to experiment with stakes that have fewer numbers of wards in them.
Yeah, one way to think about this is to look at where these wards were created, right? So, yeah, there were some in Utah, but most of them are not in Utah where you have dense populations of Mormons. So what it could be, kind of going off of what Rick said, is this is a way to help retention. If you've got a stake that is made up of 8 wards and they're spread out over a 600 square mile radius or something, right? Then bringing them all together for a stake conference is really, really difficult. Whereas if we shrink the number of wards, we shrink the geographic area included in a stake, and suddenly it's much easier to bring people together for stake conferences and for stake leadership meetings. Plus, you've got more positions for people.
Yeah.
positions generally hold. So
yeah, you have that many more opportunities for someone to be on the stake high council, that many more opportunities for someone to hold a stake calling. It's just, that's what I think is going on.
Okay. Okay, we've got a couple comments from listeners. I just want to read a few and respond. Peter writes, Elder Holland stated in 2016 that double-digit growth was the church's biggest problem. How do we reconcile that statement compared to the numbers presented?
Yeah, he was wrong.
Okay.
It's not a problem anymore.
Yeah, they don't have double-digit growth.
They haven't had double-digit. I don't know. You look back. There are some years with 8%, some years approaching 9%, but I haven't seen double-digit growth in a very long time.
Well, yeah, and you got to be really careful with numbers, right? So this is one of the things I point out in a couple of my articles is if you've got a really small base and then you add to that,
Exactly,
and you can easily get double-digit growth, right?
Yeah.
But if you're talking about a very big base, it takes a lot of growth to get to
Right.
double-digit growth. And at this point, they have, in most countries, a sizable base. So double-digit growth is pretty much not going to happen.
Yeah. Confined to Africa, where there are
Small
fewer
base.
members than there, there are fewer members in Africa than there are in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras combined, and so
Right.
small base makes for rapid percentage increases.
Exactly.
Okay. The next question is, this is a comment from Jamie. They did this to us yesterday, took 2 stakes and made it into 3 with less wards per stake. Stake president said he was taught the doctrine of rightsizing from the people above him. Any reactions to that?
Right-sizing. I like that. Right? That's a great kind of buzzword, right-sizing the stakes. Sounds exactly like what we were just describing, right? That they've come up with a new idea. They're trying something new out that suggests that having smaller number of wards per stake is a better way to maintain kind of growth or to maintain membership numbers, to give people opportunities to serve, and probably to shrink that geographic area in places outside of Utah where it's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Like maybe some Bain consultant basically said, you'll do better with retention if you have less units per stake or something like that, right?
I wouldn't doubt that at all.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, one more, and this is from Gabe. She says, we just had a new stake created in Vegas with very little membership growth at the ward level. I speculated that the stakes want to get smaller to better micromanage things at the ward level. Okay, so I mean, we're getting...
We have our deductive theory, and all of a sudden all of our observations are coming in, so that's good.
I love it. I love it. Okay, so listeners, we're loving your comments. Please keep them coming. A few people have said that they're having trouble with the audio if it's choppy. If that's true, let me know and I'll fix it. Just post those comments there. Okay, and just to close out this point about largest number of new stakes created, it's a fact that the church continues, as I understand it, to have less units per stake and more members per stake. Is that true?
The general trend has been rising numbers of members per stake. One of the things that is interesting to do is to look at the number of convert baptisms in a year and divide by the number of stakes in a year, and that will tell you, how many stakes per how many members in a given year. That number has been increasing steadily, and now it may be the case that they've figured out, it could very well be that retention is improving and that number is going to start going down. But this robust stake growth has been for the past couple of years yet. So I think we're going to have to wait a while to see if it constitutes a trend.
Okay. All right. Let's jump to the point number 2. Rapid growth accelerates in West Africa. And I'm not going to go into this in detail other than to say that convert baptisms in Africa West area was over 27,000. It's talking about growth in Nigeria, growth in Ghana, growth in Liberia, et cetera, et cetera. Any comments, Ryan? We'll start with you on this one. Any responses on that?
Yeah, so that's basically exactly where we would expect the growth based on my research in particular, but the research that Rick and I have done. Going back to a paper that I published, I don't know, I have to go back and look at the date, 2010, right? which is called the secular transition. And people can find it on my website, or we can put a link if people want it. But I argued that, and the numbers certainly supported at the time, I had data up through 2006, that the church grows most rapidly in rapidly developing countries, in countries that are not developing at all, and in countries that are highly developed economically. There's no growth of the LDS Church. So where do we have places that are growing? West Africa makes sense, right? So where would we expect any growth if there's going to be growth? It's in West Africa. And that's, yeah, absolutely. So those numbers align perfectly with what we hypothesized 6 years ago as far as major drivers for LDS growth.
Okay. Rick, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, that's, Africa has been an area of robust growth for a while. It's still the last, I mean, if you think about it, West Africa is, or Africa is the sort of most recent territory that's opened up. I mean, all things being equal, missionaries have been in Africa for obvious reasons, West Africa, not as long as they have been in Europe and Central America. So there's still untapped resources there. But again, I think a caveat is useful. I mean, there are 1 billion people in Africa, and there are more Mormons in, if you look at Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, there are more Mormons in those 3 Central American countries than there are in the entire continent of Africa. So again, I think it'll take some time to see whether this is something that is sustained or whether or not growth in Africa is going to regress to the mean, which, seems likely to me.
Yeah. So there are some obvious answers that we could come up with as to why the church grows in developing countries. Why don't you guys just take your best stab at explaining why?
Well, one of the things that I think is that the one thing the church does very well is use an ecclesiastical parallel to a corporate model. There's a hierarchy. You are giving a calling, and if you're a good steward in that calling, you go on to higher callings. And so I think it is a good training ground for someone who wants to understand how Western corporations work, or it's a great model for how to succeed in business. One of the reasons why in my mission, new immigrants were attracted to the church. We saw lots of new immigrants attracted to the church because it can help people be upwardly mobile. When I was going to graduate school in New Jersey, the ward had English classes. They had all kinds of resources to sort of help people in very practical ways. And so I think the church has some real world benefits as well as spiritual theological benefits. It's a great, for decades, we've talked about Mormonism as a quintessentially American institution. So to the extent that people want to be in a Western economy, or people want to succeed in a Western economy, it's a great complement to that kind of mindset, to that kind of change.
Ryan, what would you add?
Again, going back to that paper that I published, we argue, I think Rick is right, that all of that is certainly true at a more kind of theoretical level, if we can go a little theoretical, and hopefully we don't lose all your listeners at this point. Maybe they're totally into this. But one of the things that I argue is in pre-developed countries, right, so countries that have really low levels of development, they also have a sense of connectedness in their communities. So they still feel like they belong. But when you experience rapid periods of economic development, you also experience periods of dislocation and anomie. It's the French term for kind of a disconnectedness or chaos, right? And that's when these religions that offer a sense of community, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning in life, when they seem to do really, really well. The same thing holds for Jehovah's Witnesses, right? So if you look at their growth patterns in those types of countries, they come in these particular situations where people feel dislocated because they've moved from a countryside or a small town, they're moving to a big city, they're working in a factory, their sense of belonging and meaning has kind of disappeared. Then you tack on everything that Rick just said, which is they give you a sense of, here we're going to help you professionalize, but they're also adding a sense of community and meaning, and that makes them particularly appealing. So there's a very specific window in which we would expect the LDS Church to grow. And certainly the countries in West Africa are in that window right now. So it makes sense that they would be growing right now.
Interestingly, I had a comment from a listener about the church growth in Spain. Eduardo wrote, the church growth in Spain depends on all the people coming from Ecuador and Peru, people that are very humble. When I spent a lot of time in Western Europe and in the UK, the feedback I got from the UK saints is that the vast majority of baptisms in the UK are immigrants from Africa and from the Philippines, etc. So if the church were just to say these people are more humble, they're more open to the gospel, that the wealthy, educated people are blinded by their money and their pride and their education, do you guys have a response to that, or is that not a serious kind of point?
I think you started out saying we're not going to attack the church, right?
Okay. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine what they would say, and what would your...
Sure.
If they were to say that, what would your response be? Not to criticize, just to respond.
Sure, just to respond. So, and it's a great point, right? I think that language, the humility language, is still used. It was used during my mission, right? That we would talk about, oh, you know, those rich people, they're the arrogant ones. They're not kind of willing to listen. And I think, and I actually argue this in one of my books, right? What You Don't Know About Religion But Should, that in a sense, it's Orwellian doublespeak, right? So it's not so much about humility. Humility is completely irrelevant to this discussion. It's just a way of kind of trying to build up those people who are receptive for other reasons. The humility argument, I think, is a really flawed, damaging argument for lots of other people, right? So when they say that it's about humility, I don't think it has anything to do with humility. Yes, there may be poverty associated with that, but it's not the poverty. The immigrants fit perfectly with the model that I just described, right? There's dislocation. They don't feel like they connect. They don't feel like they belong anywhere. And what does the Mormon church do really, really well? I mean, I don't think anybody would argue about the sense of community. Mormon church gives a sense of community. Maybe it's artificial. Certainly you could go after that. But I think there's a really compelling argument to be made that they bring people in, they help them adjust, they help them kind of assimilate into the new society. They give them a sense of community. And that's why they're so appealing to immigrants. Has nothing to do with humility, right? Humility it's a red herring that they use to build themselves up and say, oh, we're better than the people who aren't receptive, right? I don't buy it for a second, and there are other reasons if we want to go down that path. Rick, take it away.
I will. You know, when I was a missionary, I was in New Orleans. We used to always go to the most humble parts of town because people will let you in. You could teach a discussion. I mean, you know, when you tracked out $1 million houses, nobody comes to the door. Nobody lets you in. You tracked out a housing project. You're teaching discussions all day long. That has spiritual benefits for the missionary and practical benefits to the missionary. When I was in graduate school, I was studying a ward. I wrote my dissertation on a ward in New Jersey. And I remember the bishop and the missionaries used to clash all the time because the bishop would say, hey, I want you to I want you guys tracting in my neighborhood. How come I never see you tracting in my neighborhood? And the missionaries would always say, we do tract in that neighborhood sometimes, and nobody lets us in. And we prefer to go, most of the investigators came from the poor parts of town. So I don't completely dismiss the humble thing. I mean, it could be, it's also power and class probably. But it's generally the case. I mean, there are some sociologists who say at a macro level, the more existentially secure a society is, the less religious it is. The societies that are, existentially insecure are probably more amenable to strict religion, and that may work at the individual level. Could be that people who are in more humble circumstances are more receptive. I mean, if the world's treating you great, you don't need a religion that's in contrast to the world. I mean, I don't know.
Well, and I think there may be two uses of the word humble here that we're kind of conflating, right?
Yeah, I'm making a euphemism for poor. I should just say poor.
We should just say poor, right? Because really when you're talking about humility, it's people who are not arrogant, right? Who are building themselves up saying, I'm better than everybody else. And I don't think that rich people necessarily do that, right? I mean, maybe some do, right? I mean, current president-elect aside, right? But certainly some people do that. But I don't think on average people are just going, oh, well, I'm wealthier than they are, so I'm clearly better than they are. So it's conflating the two.
Right. Yeah. They just don't need religion.
They don't need religion, right? So once you get past a certain point, it doesn't mean that you're arrogant. It just means you don't need religion, that you have more money. So when they use that, it really is a conflation of two uses of the word humble. And we got to be really, really careful because it's not about humility. It's about social dislocation and poverty. Those are the big factors that drive this, not that somebody's like, oh, I, respect blah, blah, blah. The examples that I use in my book, right? Mormons will often, and I don't mean to like completely stereotype all Mormons, but they will say things like, oh, you're so arrogant, right, that you don't think you need to kind of bow yourself before God. And honestly, right, I mean, I don't think there's anything more the opposite of arrogant, right, more humble than saying, I don't even know if there is a God. It's an open question, and I'm open to having my mind changed about things, right? That's actually the exact opposite of arrogance. It's saying I don't know, right? When people are like, oh, no, that's arrogant. Well, how is that arrogant versus somebody saying, I definitively know that there is a God? Where's your evidence, right? That seems to me like an arrogant, proudful, boastful claim where you have no evidence to support it. So it's a bit pet peeve of mine.
I struck a nerve. Really quickly, April writes, my friend's son is currently serving in Africa and has indicated baptisms are high, but retention is low. And that's something we know that in Latin America, retention rates are around 10, 20% at best. Also, Ryan, you'll be interested to know that Matthew writes, always great to see a former fellow Mountain Green Ward member. That's what
the second Mountain Green heretic.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump on to the next point. The next point in the article is that the church creates its first stakes in 3 nations. Benin, which I've never heard of. Apparently.
West Africa.
It's a West African nation. Yeah, I apologize. I haven't heard of that. Benin, he wrote Czechia. I've heard of Chechnya, but never Czechia. But
it's the Czech Republic.
Czech Republic. So there's a stake there, and one in Liberia. These
also in West Africa.
Right. Mm-hmm. So these are all. These seem to be. Is it fair to call the Czech Republic a developing country? I mean,
it's fully developed. I think they probably just have enough members there for a stake.
Okay.
Who knows how many expats are in Prague right now that comprise the backbone of that stake? I mean.
Right. Okay.
They're also in a weird class because they're a former communist country, right? So growth there has been recent. So they haven't had a lot of growth since, it's all been post the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Got it. So is there anything, does there anything significant for you guys for the creation of those stakes in countries for the first time? Does that tell us anything about health, about growth, anything?
Well, it would be another data point to suggest that Africa is the locus of the most robust growth within the church.
Okay, right. Okay, LDS growth trends improve in Central America. And I serve my mission in Guatemala. Retention rates have been abysmal there. They had really outrageous baptismal practices. But now they're basically saying that growth trends are improving in Guatemala. A net increase of 10 wards and branches, highest percentage of increase in number of congregations in over 15 years. Any thoughts or reactions to that?
One of the things that I think is interesting generally that we need to talk about is the idea of measurement, operationalization, what constitutes a member. One of the things that's interesting about the LDS Church is that if you're baptized and confirmed, you're considered to be a Mormon. And really, if you ask Latter-day Saints in their congregations, being baptized and confirmed isn't the culmination of the conversion process. It's the beginning of the conversion process. And I think that's part of the reason why retention rates are low. Also, if you think about, how easy it is to be a Mormon, it's incredibly easy to become a Mormon. You should go down to your local synagogue and ask the rabbi there what the process is for converting to Judaism. Or think about converting to Catholicism, where the rite of Christian initiation for adults admits new Catholics once a year. I wonder what growth rates would be like in the LDS Church if we only admitted members once a year, or if instead of being baptized and confirmed, you're counted as a member, you're counted as a member after a year of full tithe paying or something like that. Or think about it in terms of not the raw number of convert baptisms, but look at the LDS Church's worldwide growth outreach and think about the amount of money spent per convert, or the amount of money spent per retained convert. there was a article that I read in the 90s that looked at the correlation between growth rates and the number of missionaries, and it was a very tight growth rate. I mean, if you send a massive sales force around the world knocking on doors selling widgets, you're going to sell some widgets. We just went through this sort of double cohort surge because the missionary age was changed, and I think a lot of this could be a lagging bump of baptisms that come from this the huge jump in the size of the number of missionaries. So, you know, I can't see how things have changed structurally in Central America. Retention rates are absolutely have been absolutely abysmal. The statistics for 2016 point to lots of problems in Mexico. I don't know why things would be different in Mexico than they would be in Guatemala or El Salvador. So I'm, you know, again, and it's the kind of thing where I'm like, let's wait and see. These indicators are noisy. I think our best bet is to sit tight and see if things wash out long term.
Ryan?
I think Rick's hitting it on this one. Yeah,
okay.
We'll just keep it short.
I'll just say that it's hard for me to trust numbers coming out of Guatemala or Central America, because it could be real growth, or it could be an aggressive area presidency,
exactly,
re-implementing super aggressive baptism tactics with missionaries that we've seen, you know, as early back as the baseball baptism scandals in the UK in the early 1960s. We've seen baseball baptisms in Japan. It's just hard to know what any of that really means. And it really does beg the question, I should have asked this from the very beginning. Ryan, I'll ask you, why do you think the church doesn't just publish its activity rates? Why do you think the church isn't just fully transparent with that information? I know I'm asking you to speculate. Do you have a theory?
Well, I mean, I think Rick probably does here, but my initial thought would be, I think if we went back 40 years, which I think they did at one point, didn't they, Rick?
At one point they used to, it's funny because you can see them dropping indicators that will tell you what's going on. So at one point they used to tabulate the number of babies blessed, and then they used to tabulate the number of baptisms of children of record. And so you could just move 8 years into the future and see how many babies that were blessed never made it to the baptismal font. And once people started looking at that number, the number of babies blessed, I believe, was quietly dropped from the ledger. So, I mean, activity rates in the church, the funny thing about activity rates in the church is they have always been the elephant in the room, and it's always been sort of the secret that that nobody talks about. What's funny is that in 2006, I wrote an article called Rethinking the International Expansion of Mormonism. And in that article, I looked at the census data for various nations and looked at the disparity between the number of members claimed by the church and the number of self-reported Latter-day Saints on census forms for the nations that took the census. And I found that it correlates closely with growth rates. The degree of over-reporting in a nation correlates with the nation's growth rate. And one of the things about that, I was a fairly innocuous article, but man, I have never been, you know, I've said some bad things about the church, and I've got some, you know, but man, I lost all my friends. You know, that was, so you can, you know, talking about Joseph Smith as a money digger or the husband of teenage brides might get you in a little bit of trouble, but man, going after the growth rates really got me in big trouble.
Well, and I think they're in over their head is the problem. That's what I was going to say, is if we had gone back 40 years and they just had those numbers and they just kept reporting them this whole time, then you probably would have seen kind of a divergence between growth and attendance that would have just continued over time, right? But they didn't. And now, if they were to suddenly release, here's how many people actually are going versus how many we claim, the disparity would be so big, right? That I think it would blow a lot of people's minds, and it would really upset a lot of members, because Mormons love, and again, that's a bit of a stereotype, but they love to tout their numbers, right? The numbers come out regularly. We've got 15, we've got 15.7, we've got all these members, but no one wants to mention, again, what Rick said, the elephant in the room, right, is that most of those people aren't attending.
Although I think they have been backing off touting the numbers somewhat. Based partly, I think, on the things that we've been doing, things that other people have been writing.
The church has an article out of Mormon Newsroom called "Growth of the Church." In the last paragraph, it says, according to the National Council of Churches, the LDS Church is the second fastest growing church in the United States. So it starts with that.
That is, first of all, that is just patently false. You know, it might be the fastest growing denomination with over X number of members, but there again, the percent growth in membership has to do with your baseline numbers, and I guarantee you there are many small denominations that are growing substantially faster than the LDS Church. That's crazy.
Yeah. So, but then it goes on to say, however, it's weird that it starts with that sentence, but then it goes on to say, despite its increasing numbers, the church cautions against overemphasis on growth statistics. It's basically saying we're number two, but don't pay attention.
That's called having your cake and eating it too, right? Because so if you can tout your growth, but if people say, hey, you're touting your growth, they can say, oh no, look at this caveat.
Yeah. It goes on to say in this article that comparisons don't take into consideration activity rates and death rates and methodology for counting members. So at least in all fairness, it's warning people to not pay too much attention to the numbers in this article that it
that touts the numbers.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just thought it'd be journalistically fair to mention.
Right. Well, and I mean, one thing that it's worth mentioning, Rick and I hang out at least twice a year, well, at least once a year, right, at SSR meetings with some of the social scientists who work for the church. They've read these articles. They know exactly what we're talking about. I mean, they have the actual numbers, right? So I'm guessing, just like a lot of things that come out of the church these days, that was a two-headed press release, right? So you've got those who are saying, look how great we are, and then they've got the actual social scientists on the back end who are like, hey, guys, come on.
Amp it down, kids.
Amp it down. We know the actual numbers, and they don't look anything like what you're actually saying.
Right. Yeah.
There are ways using existing data sources to tease out activity. That's some of the things that Ryan and I have done in the past, is sort of looked at levels of apostasy and activity rates using various data sources. And seems to me that levels of apostasy and inactivity are definitely on the rise. Now, if the trend is, if these new numbers herald some sort of reversal of the trend, I'll be the first to admit that that's the case. It could be, but too soon to tell.
Okay. Very cool. All right. Let's continue. It goes on to talk about significant LDS growth developments in Asia. It talks about Cambodia, talks about Hong Kong, Mongolia. And I'm just going to kind of condense these because I think we're kind of making the same point. Point 6 talks about the Congo. Part 7 talks about progress in Oceania, which includes Samoa and Australia. I don't mean to just sort of give any of those a short shrift, but tell me if I'm wrong in just saying those are all basically saying the same thing.
Pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think there's some nuance, particularly number 5, right, where you've got growth in Cambodia, but again, the church is new in Cambodia, it hasn't been around for a long time, versus growth in Hong Kong. So yeah, you've got more growth in Cambodia than you would in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, it looks more like the realignment that we were talking about in stakes, right? So there's some subtle nuance there, but generally, yeah, I think we're talking about the exact same thing. Same thing in Oceania, right? I mean, Samoa has had Mormons for a very, very long time. They've got a lot of Mormons there. So when they say, new congregations or new stakes were organized, this sounds more like the congregational shifting stuff rather than actual growth of members.
Okay. All right. Rick, anything to add?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. Number 8 is new temples. Does that tell us anything? New temples in Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Zimbabwe.
I think the Russian temple building under President Hinckley was a...
Wait, what, did you say Russian temple?
The rush in temple, the expansion of,
Okay.
Was a substantial policy shift for the church. And I think the idea was, if you build them, they will come. And so making temples accessible is a strategy, because the idea is that the more people we can get endowed, the better retention will be. That having a temple is important for convert retention and for sustained activity, and that's why you see this explosion in temple building.
Yeah. But I also, I think it's worth noting, usage of these temples is not anything like what most of the members in Salt Lake Valley understand the usage to be, right? So a lot of these temples are open, one day a week, maybe one, it's not the same as the Jordan River Temple, right? Or the Salt Lake City Temple or the Bountiful Temple, where they're open 5 days a week, 6 days a week, and they've got lots of people going through. These are placeholders, right? They built a lot, they bought a lot, they built a building, and they do exactly what Rick said. They bring people in very, very rarely. They have them open a little bit, right? But it's really just kind of,
it's built very in anticipation of our need for it, which will be.
Got it. Okay. So because they're all in developing countries, and because, we don't know how well attended they are, we can't really read a lot from this other than that the church has disposable income to build more temples. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the church is doing well financially.
That is not in dispute.
All right. Number 9 is LDS congregations in Syria and Iraq. That again follows the developing countries sort of model, but that's interesting, right? Especially given the leaks that came out last year when that one senator from Oregon was caught saying that he voted for the Iraq war because it would lead to increased missionary effort, or at least in part because it would lead to increased missionary work in the Middle East. Do you guys remember what I'm talking about there?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. I remember watching the video. Yeah. So there was I think he was a representative, right? So a congressional representative who had been brought in to speak to the
He was a senator.
Yeah, he was a senator.
Yeah.
And he was talking about that very issue, right? That he was trying to pull some strings and support the work of the gospel going forward. So I do remember watching that video. Those two are kind of interesting, right? One, Syria, growth in Syria right now, right? Like Syria's got issues, major issues. So to be talking about growth of the church in Syria is surprising, right? But prior to the civil war, Syria was one of the more, that's going to sound awkward, right? But kind of more progressive, predominantly Muslim countries, right? So it would make sense prior to the civil war, but right now with the civil war going on, that's really, really kind of unusual. And then Iraq, I have to wonder, are these native Iraqis or are we talking about expats?
Well, it's probably a lot of expats, and it's probably any kind of proselytizing that takes place would have to take place among Christians that are already there.
Right.
Syria has a large Christian population relative to many Islamic nations, and so I suspect there's lots of any work that's being done is being done among Iraqi Christians, Syrian Christians, against the law to convert from Islam to Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's it. I would love to hear any listeners who are members of the church in Syria or Iraq come on Mormon Stories and talk about what that's like.
There are probably some service members that would be able to tell you too, that are stationed.
Yeah, no, that'd be interesting, but also just native people. That'd be fascinating. So if there are any listeners in the Middle East, please reach out to Mormon Stories. We'd love to interview you about what that's like. All right, the last one is Canada. Canada reported a net increase of 8 congregations in 2016, the largest increase since 2003. Now, this sort of challenges maybe some of our assertions that it's mostly uneducated, developing countries, or does it?
No, because most of that growth is in Alberta, and what you have are large groups of lifelong Latter-day Saints that fled polygamy, or that fled the United States to avoid polygamy prosecution, that live in Lethbridge and in Alberta, and they have higher birth rates than other Canadians. And so a lot of that growth is the increase in births of lifelong, multi-generational Latter-day Saints in the Western provinces.
You also have to recognize Canada is very open to immigration, right?
Yeah.
So partly immigration too, right? The going back to that previous conversation we had, that in highly developed countries, the only people who tend to really be interested in converting are immigrants, and Canada is certainly open to immigration.
Got it. Okay. I'm gonna just read a couple quick comments that are on the live stream. Eduardo from Spain says that temple activity in Spain is very low. That's what he says. Joyce reminds us that it was Senator Gordon Smith, former Senator Gordon Smith of Oregon, that made that comment about missionary work benefiting from the Iraq War. Peter writes, Canadian here, my small town in Alberta had a ward split into a ward and a branch with not really any numbers for either. They were told specifically the goal was to increase retention and proselyting efforts to justify the split. So that's, isn't it great to get this real-time anecdotal sort of
Awesome.
feet on the ground feedback? I love it. All right, so thanks to everyone who's been commenting on Facebook Live. Please continue. It makes such a rich conversation.